Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The sky above Inyana carried the color of forgotten sorrow. Not quite dark, not quite light, just somewhere in between, like Mary's life had always been. The village sat quiet beneath the weight of dusk, its red clay roads cracked like lips long thirsty, its houses slouched in time, built from patience and leftover dreams. A faded breeze drifted lazily between raffia rooftops and crooked fences, carrying smells of wood smoke, pap leaves, and poverty. Mary moved through it with the stiffness of someone who had cried so much that her tears had turned to dust inside her. Her mother was gone, taken not by violence or accident, but by the slow hand of an illness that fed on helplessness. The doctor in Bambara had called it lung collapse, but Mary knew better. It was hunger, it was stress, it was the price of too many unpaid prayers. She had left her job as a maid 2 days before, with nothing in her purse except the last 300 Nigerian nairas and a half-ripped bus ticket. Her employer, a wealthy woman with eyes like polished stones, barely noticed when she left. "Tell that girl not to forget her mop," the woman had said, not knowing or caring that the girl she referred to was rushing to catch her mother's final breath. But Mary didn't make it. Mama Ebel had died alone in their mud-walled hut, curled on her side like a child in sleep, her hand gripping a Bible so worn its pages had turned to onion skin. The neighbors had already gathered, tongues clacking, heads shaking with a sorrow that felt more obligatory than real. Mary had stared at her mother's still face for a long time, waiting for her chest to rise, but it never did. And now, a funeral needed to be arranged, a coffin, a cloth, diggers, a resting place, all of which cost money. Money Mary didn't have, not even in borrowed hopes. They say desperation doesn't knock, it kicks the door in. And by the third night after her mother's death, Mary sat outside their empty home, watching the stars blink like shy witnesses, and realized she had run out of options. No amount of fasting, crying, or village goodwill could buy the burial rites. People gave her words, not help. One offered old wrappers, another a spoon of rice. But no one gave cash, not even enough to rent the smallest wooden box for the body. Her relatives were distant in more ways than one. Those who answered her calls said, "We'll pray for you," and hung up before she could beg. Even the village elder, a man with silver hair and a tongue soaked in proverbs, told her, "Child, a burial must honor the dead, or their spirit walks the earth without peace." His advice echoed like a bell in a canyon, deep but empty. Mary couldn't sleep that night. Grief sat beside her like a heavy ant, breathing in her ear, refusing to leave. That's when she remembered a whisper she'd heard months ago at her boss's party. One of the catering girls had spoken about a man, rich, secretive, known for deals that never saw daylight. "If you're desperate," she had said, "he pays big, for one night." Mary had dismissed it then, thinking it was foolish, dirty talk. But now, with her mother's body lying stiff in the heat and the smell of unwashed pain hanging in the air, it didn't sound so foolish. It sounded like the only way out. So she bathed, wore her least tattered dress, and took the last of her savings for transport into Bambara. The journey was slow, the potholes deep, and the bus rattled like a cage. With each passing mile, her stomach twisted. She told herself she was doing this for her mother. But deep down, she knew it was also to escape the shame of burying her with nothing. When she arrived in Bambara, the city was alive in ways that mocked her sorrow. Neon signs blinked like artificial stars, men in pressed suits laughed into their phones, and women with long legs and longer weaves strutted past her without seeing her. Mary clutched her bag tightly, the fear rising inside her like floodwater. But there was no turning back. Through the contact of a girl named Ada, one of those who worked cleaning jobs around the upper hills, Mary was given a number, a name, and an address. Ada had hesitated before sharing it. "He's not cruel," she'd said, "but he's not kind either. He doesn't hit, but he doesn't care. It's just business to him." Mary didn't ask for more. She had made up her mind. She dialed the number. A deep male voice answered, clipped, professional, with no warmth. "Tomorrow, 9 p.m. sharp. Wear black, no lipstick, no perfume. Do not speak unless spoken to. The driver will come for you." The line went dead. Mary stood in the middle of a busy market, the buzz of bodies all around her, yet she felt as if she had been dropped into a hole with no bottom. That night she didn't sleep. She lay on the floor of a distant cousin's room, staring at the fan spinning slowly above her, imagining her mother's face, and wondering if her spirit would understand what she was about to do. "You said never to sell myself," Mary whispered into the dark. "But you also said never to let shame bury the dead." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Mama." Morning came like a thief, too fast, too bright, and Mary rose as if led by a hand she couldn't see. At exactly 9 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up in front of her cousin's compound. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in neighborhoods where children played barefoot and men hawked roasted maize under flickering bulbs. The driver stepped out without a word, dressed in all black, his face unreadable. Mary got in. The seat smelled like leather and secrets. The windows were tinted so deeply she couldn't see outside. The drive was long and silent, the engine purring like a well-fed beast. Her palms were sweaty, her chest tight. She didn't know if she wanted to cry or vomit. The car climbed the upper hills, where the roads were smooth and the air felt expensive. Finally, it pulled into a compound surrounded by high walls and electric gates. The mansion ahead was more glass than stone, glowing like a lantern in the night. Inside, the floor gleamed like ice, and a woman with a clipboard led her down a long corridor. No one smiled. No one spoke. Just silence, stretched thin as a spider's web. Then she saw him. Damien Cole, standing at the far end of a lounge, wearing a shirt the color of storm clouds, holding a drink without drinking. He looked at her like one might look at a painting in a museum, appraising, not admiring. His voice, when he finally spoke, was smooth and sharp. "Undress. We don't have time for drama." And just like that, the night began. Mary didn't cry. She didn't scream. She floated outside herself, watching from a corner of the ceiling as her body became a transaction. It was over in less than an hour. No words, no warmth, just payment. He placed an envelope on the table. "You can take the car back, or not. Your choice." Mary walked out barefoot. She clutched the envelope like it was a torch in a cave. That night, she didn't sleep. She just sat at the edge of her cousin's mattress, counting the money over and over until it no longer looked like currency, just ink and paper soaked in shame. The sun had only begun to stretch its long fingers over the rust-colored rooftops when Mary stepped into the small churchyard. A few roosters crowed half-heartedly in the distance, and the morning air held the kind of silence that made everything feel like it was holding its breath. The grave had settled, the red soil slightly sunken, as if the earth itself had bowed under the weight of the woman now resting beneath. Mary stood motionless, her wrapper tied tightly around her waist. The old scarf her mother used to wear now looped carefully around her own head. Her shadow stretched long across the grave, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Her arms hung at her sides like wet cloth, and her mouth pressed into a firm line as if even the thought of speaking might unravel her completely. The few people who had come for the burial, neighbors, friends of her mother, distant relatives, had all returned to their routines. No one lingered. Why would they? Death was like dust in their town, expected, inevitable, unwelcome, but rarely surprising. And yet Mary remained. For a long while she knelt down and pressed her fingers into the soft clay, scooping a handful and letting it sift through her palm. The earth stained her skin red again, but this time she didn't wipe it away. It felt fitting, honest. She remembered the last conversation she had with her mother the night before her passing. It had been brief, mostly whispers and wheezing. Her mother had looked up at her, her eyes dim but warm, and had said only one thing clearly: "Don't let shame bury you too." At the time, Mary hadn't understood. But now, standing at the edge of her mother's final resting place, those words circled her like crows. She looked around the yard one last time before rising slowly. Her legs were stiff, her back aching from hours of planning, pacing, and pretending. She walked out of the church compound without speaking to anyone, and by the time she reached the roadside, the vendors were beginning to set up their stalls, calling out prices with the same careless rhythm of every other day. The world hadn't changed, but Mary had. The days that followed were a blur of silence and obligation. Mary returned to the house she shared with 3 other girls, all of them housemaids or cleaners in the wealthier parts of town. They had welcomed her back with a strange mix of sympathy and suspicion, though no one asked questions directly. There was an unspoken rule among them. What one did to survive remained unspoken unless the wound refused to heal on its own. Mary stayed mostly to herself, rising early, washing the little she had, and helping with chores she wasn't assigned. She didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't cruel. It was just necessary. She had become someone else. Not better. Not worse. Just different. On the 3rd night after the burial, she sat alone at the edge of the backyard, watching the moon slip behind a cloud. Her hands were raw from scrubbing the kitchen floor earlier that day, but she welcomed the sting. It grounded her. She replayed every moment from that night, the heavy silence, the way he'd looked at her as if she were something he had never seen before, and yet had no intention of understanding. He hadn't spoken much, only asked her name once, and had given her his in return with all the weight of a man who thought names were things to be owned. Damien. That was what he had said, voice quiet, almost tired. She hadn't looked at him long enough to commit his face to memory, but his voice lingered in her mind like the aftertaste of bitter herbs. She hadn't expected to see him again. That night was meant to be a transaction, closed and buried just like her mother. But fate is never fond of being told what to do. The next morning she received a message from a private number. "Just 2 lines. I hope you found peace. If you ever need work, call this number." There was no name attached, but she knew who it was from instantly. She stared at the message for hours, debating whether to delete it, reply, or throw the phone entirely. In the end, she did nothing. She left the message there, like a secret folded beneath her skin. The days rolled into each other, indistinguishable, and Mary's life returned to something that resembled routine, except it wasn't. Something in her had shifted, and no matter how tightly she tried to wrap her life in silence, the past had already stretched its arms into her future. 1 week after the burial, Mary walked into the market square carrying a basket of vegetables. The place buzzed with life, bargaining, shouting, children running barefoot through puddles. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning for the familiar stall where she usually bought pepper. As she rounded the corner, her shoulder brushed against someone, and she mumbled an apology, barely lifting her gaze. But the man she bumped into didn't move. She felt his presence linger like a question, and when she finally looked up, she saw him. Damien, standing in full daylight, dressed in a simple cream shirt and dark slacks, without the arrogance she remembered. His eyes met hers without hesitation, and in that moment, the noise of the market dulled. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just looked at her as if they'd never met, and yet always had. Mary's throat tightened, her mind scrambling for something to say, some way to escape the strange, sudden gravity of his presence. But before she could speak, he nodded, stepped aside, and walked past her. No words, No questions. Just gone. She turned around to watch him disappear into the crowd, her heart beating in odd, uncertain rhythms. She stood there for several moments, her basket dangling from her arm, forgotten. That encounter should have ended the matter, closed the chapter for good, but it did the opposite. It reopened something she didn't even realize she'd sealed. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on her mat, eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering why a man like him, cold, distant, purposeful, had crossed paths with someone like her not once, but twice. She didn't want answers, not really. But curiosity has a cruel way of turning silence into noise. 2 days after the market encounter, Mary found herself holding the small, wrinkled paper again, the one with the private number and short message. She stared at it until the numbers blurred, then dialed it without fully knowing why. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. Silence. Then his voice, clear and steady. "You called," he said, like he'd been waiting. She swallowed. "I need work," she replied, unsure if it was truth or excuse. A long pause. Then, "Come to Orchid Hill. The gate will be open." He ended the call without another word. That night, Mary packed her few belongings into a small nylon bag. She didn't tell the girl she lived with. She didn't know what to expect, but something in her told her this was a door and not everyone was allowed to knock on twice. By morning, she stood in front of the estate gate at Orchid Hill. It was taller than she remembered, colder, somehow more silent than before. The security man, older and quiet, opened the gate with a nod. No questions. She stepped in, unsure if she was walking into something better, worse, or simply inevitable. The driveway was long, and as she walked, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the palm trees that lined the edge. At the door, she paused, took one breath, then another, and knocked. The door opened before the sound even settled. And there he was, again, not surprised, not smiling, just waiting. The scent of polish and pine oil hung heavy in the Accor residence that morning as Mary dragged the mop across the white-tiled floor like a soldier pulling a wounded leg through a battlefield. It had been 3 weeks since her mother's burial, 3 long weeks of silence, spent nursing a body that didn't feel like hers anymore. She had returned to Bambra as if nothing had happened, slipping back into her old role like a shadow stepping into its former shape. No one noticed the difference. No one asked. She went about scrubbing the marble staircase, washing the car tires, preparing breakfast before dawn for people who didn't look her in the eye. On that particular day, the radio was playing high-life music in the kitchen, and the smell of fried plantains filled the air, reminding her painfully of her mother's Sunday mornings. She blinked back the memory, focused on peeling yam, and tried to will her hands not to shake. Then the voice called her name. She dropped the knife. "Mary," said Mrs. Okoro, standing in the doorway with her arms folded like folded arms could protect her from bad news. "Someone's asking for you." Mary wiped her hands on her wrapper, confused. She hadn't told anyone she was back except her cousin, and even he barely responded to her texts anymore. As she walked into the parlor, her breath caught. Damien was standing there, too sharp, too clean, too completely out of place in a house that smelled of dust and domestic sweat. He didn't look at the furniture. He didn't sit. His hands were in his pockets, his eyes locked onto her as though he were still trying to solve her like a riddle. Mary's feet stopped moving. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. He stepped forward. "I need to talk to you." She shook her head, voice now ironclad. "There's nothing left to say." But there was. He said her name again, not the way rich men say a name they want to forget, but the way someone says a word that keeps echoing in their mind. She turned away and walked back to the kitchen, heart thumping against her ribs like a caged bird. She didn't see the small smile that pulled at the corner of his mouth. She didn't see him watch her like a man unsure if he'd come to apologize or to complicate her life further. The following week, it was as though a veil had lifted from her world, but was now hanging overhead like an omen waiting to fall. Mary found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see Damien again. But days passed, then nights, and he didn't show. She convinced herself it was over. It had to be. The shame she carried was already too much to bear, too sticky to wash off with soap and scrubbing. Yet on Thursday evening, after she had finished folding laundry and was about to board a bus back to her compound, a driver stopped beside her in a dark SUV. The window rolled down. It was the same man who had driven her to the mansion weeks ago. He handed her a plain envelope and drove off without a word. Inside, she found a simple note, written in neat, precise handwriting. 1 hour. Just talk. I owe you that. A location followed, some cafe tucked away in the inner belly of the city. Mary stared at the note for a long time. She didn't move. The breeze was hot, thick with the smell of diesel and roasted corn. Horns blared around her, people brushed past, and yet she stood frozen, heart caught in a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. That night, sleep was a restless stranger. The next day, she found herself walking into the cafe like a sleepwalker drawn to fire. The place was quiet, dimly lit, with the hum of jazz in the background. He was already seated, stirring his tea, though it wasn't too hot. He didn't stand when she approached, just gestured toward the chair across from him. She sat stiffly, arms folded across her chest. "You shouldn't have found me," she said, her voice tight. Damien didn't flinch. "But I did." For a long time, they said nothing. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was electric. Then slowly, he spoke. Not of money. Not of lust. But of loneliness. His voice carried cracks where pride once stood. He spoke of his mother, her pills, her bathtub, and how a single moment can define a lifetime. Mary listened because she didn't know how not to. And for reasons she couldn't name, she began to speak too. Mary never expected that she'd see him again after that day, and for a while she didn't. The cafe meeting ended with no promises, no plans, just a quiet thank you and a nod. Life returned to its usual rhythms, 5 a.m. alarms, rice on the fire, uniforms to iron. But something had shifted. She began to notice how tired her reflection looked in the mirror. How joyless her voice sounded when she greeted other maids in the morning. She didn't miss Damien, not exactly. What she missed was how, for the first time in months, someone had looked at her without seeing her as a function, a tool, a body to use or ignore. Then, one rainy Saturday, as the gutters of Bambara spilled over with dirty water and umbrellas bloomed like flowers across the city, he appeared again. This time, outside her rented room in the back of a compound that smelled of kerosene and wet cloth. The neighbors peeked through their curtains. Children froze mid-game. Mary stood in the doorway, jaw tight. "You're bold," she said. He shrugged, drenched. "I didn't come to beg, just to offer." She didn't move. "Offer what?" "Time," he said, without expectations. "I want to show you something." Against her better judgment, she followed him into a part of Bambara she had never seen. Past banks and boutiques beyond the neighborhoods where people used passwords for their gates, he led her to a quiet bungalow on the edge of a golf course. Inside, the lights were warm, the floors smelled of wood, and sitting on a large red couch was a boy not more than 10. He looked up with wide eyes that matched Damien's. "This is Joel," Damien said. "He's my son." The boy tilted his head. "You're the woman he talks about," he said plainly, then went back to his book. Mary stood frozen. She wanted to ask questions, but none came. Damien simply said, "Stay for dinner." And she did. She sat beside the boy, listened to him speak about galaxies and turtles, and felt something in her heart begin to turn slowly, like the hands of a forgotten clock being wound after years of silence. In the weeks that followed, visits became a pattern, not planned, but somehow natural. Mary found herself returning to that quiet house more often than she meant to. She never brought clothes or stayed the night. She was not a mistress. She was not a nanny. She was just there. Joel adored her, though he never said it aloud. Children don't lie with their mouths. They lie with their eyes, their laughter, their ease. He would pull her into his room to show her his drawings, or ask her to read from a dusty book of folk tales. Damien never interrupted these moments. He would stand in the background, arms crossed, a softness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. One evening, after Joel had fallen asleep with his head on Mary's lap, Damien poured her a glass of juice and sat beside her. "You're not who I thought you were," he said quietly. Mary raised an eyebrow. "And who did you think I was?" He looked down, his voice nearly a whisper. "Someone I could forget." The words hung between them, heavy, awkward, real. She didn't respond. The room was too still for lies. That night, as she walked back home, her mind spun like a wheel stuck in mud. She knew better than to believe in men with money and regrets. But Joel's tiny hands, his laughter, and the quiet dinners, they weren't tricks. They were real. Or at least they felt real. And that feeling was scarier than anything Damien could buy or break. She stopped by the roadside and looked up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the city haze. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a fragile thought. What if she wasn't broken beyond repair? Mary found herself waking up in the mornings with Joel's voice in her head, his eager questions about stars and spaceships playing in her thoughts like a song stuck on loop. It was strange how quickly his presence had settled into her, like a pebble dropped in a bowl of water, small but impossible to ignore. She still lived in her small rented space, where the roof leaked when it rained and the neighbors fought loudly enough to drown out her thoughts. But now, between those ordinary hours, she found herself part of something unexpected. Each visit to Damien's home left a residue she couldn't wash off. She tried to keep her distance, convinced this was just another temporary chapter in a life already full of broken stories. But Joel was different. He wasn't trying to win her over. He just accepted her as part of his small, careful world. He once asked her why the moon didn't fall. She had no real answer. "Because it's holding on," she said instead. The boy smiled, as if she'd said something profound. Damien, however, was more complicated. He walked around her like a man navigating unfamiliar terrain, respectful, distant, yet always watching, as though he was learning her one habit at a time. Some nights, he would sit quietly as she read to Joel, then remain in the room long after the child had fallen asleep, sipping something dark from a short glass, not saying much. Those silences weren't heavy like the ones between strangers. They were softer, pauses filled with things unsaid, like notes waiting for a melody. Mary was careful not to read too much into them. She reminded herself of the deal they once had. One night, no attachments. This new version of him, this soft-eyed man with a child who clung to her stories, was too different from the cold figure who had once bought her time. Yet every time she tried to walk away, Joel would ask when she was coming back. And that question, so simple, undid her resolve every time. Over time, she began to notice the strange patterns in Damien's behavior, things that didn't align with the version of him she had first encountered. He asked about her day, sometimes brought books he thought she might like, and once, after she had mentioned offhandedly that her slippers had broken, he left a new pair at her doorstep without a word. She didn't thank him. She didn't want to owe him gratitude, but she wore them the next day. His kindness didn't come wrapped in smiles or smooth words. It came in silences and gestures, in carefully observed needs. Yet there was something off, something in the way he froze whenever Joel mentioned his mother, or how his jaw tightened if Mary stayed too long without calling. She once overheard him on the phone, arguing in hushed tones with someone she couldn't identify. The call ended with him hurling the phone across the room and leaving the house without explanation. When he returned hours later, he didn't offer any answers. He just looked tired, so very tired. Mary didn't press him. She had her own shadows to battle. One afternoon, Joel asked her directly, "Are you my new mummy?" The question struck like a hammer to glass. Mary knelt before him, placed her hand gently on his cheek, and said, "I'm your friend. That's a kind of family, too." The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, but the question lingered in her bones long after he'd run off to draw rockets. That night, Damien stood at her side on the balcony as the city pulsed below them in neon and noise. "He's never asked that before," he said quietly. Mary looked straight ahead. "Children ask what they feel, not what they understand." Damien didn't reply. He lit a cigarette, but didn't smoke it, letting it burn between his fingers until the wind took the ash. She watched him and thought about how some people aren't born cruel. They are shaped by silence, by grief, by things never resolved. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand him. But trust was a slow-growing vine, and hers had been cut too many times before. Still, her presence in his life began to feel less accidental and more like a question neither of them knew how to answer. There were things Mary began to notice, not just about Damien, but about the house itself. It was too neat. Not clean, but sterile, like no one really lived there. The walls had no family photos, no fingerprints, no life in them. Joel's drawings were always tucked away, never taped to the fridge or left on the walls like most children's art. The boy's laughter filled the space, but it never echoed. It was as if the house had ears and secrets. Once, while helping Joel with his shoes, Mary saw a locked door in the hallway she hadn't noticed before. It was plain, no handle, just a keypad. She didn't ask about it, but the sight of it clung to her mind like a thorn. That same evening, she heard Damien speaking in a tone she'd never heard before, firm, controlled, and laced with something close to threat. "You promised this was finished," he hissed into his phone. "I don't care what she wants. Keep her away." Mary didn't ask who she was, but unease settled in her chest like bad weather. She began to question whether she was truly welcomed in this life or merely tolerated because she brought comfort to Joel. One night she arrived and found the boy sobbing uncontrollably. He clung to her like a lifeline, his body shaking. "I had a dream," he said between sobs, "that someone took you away." Mary held him until his breathing slowed, trying to hush her own heart, which thudded against her ribs like it wanted out. Damien sat in the corner, silent, his head in his hands. Later that night, he opened up more than he ever had. "His mother left when he was 4, he said. "Just walked out. No note. Nothing." He looked at Mary. "I tried to raise him right, but money can't buy stability. It can't buy presence." She looked at him, this man who had once treated her like a transaction and now stood before her frayed at the edges. "And now?" she asked. He didn't answer. His silence was an answer of its own. That night, as she walked home beneath the dim buzz of faulty streetlights, Mary knew something was changing. She wasn't just part of their lives now. She was becoming essential, and that made her vulnerable in a way that frightened her more than anything. It happened quietly, almost too quietly to notice at first. A small shift in rhythm, a misplaced toy, a conversation interrupted by a shadow at the window. Then came the message, slipped beneath Damien's gate while no one was watching. It was written on torn paper in scrawled handwriting that sent cold crawling up Mary's spine. "You think she's safe? You stole from me. Now I'll take from you." No signature, no contact, just venom wrapped in ink. Damien's face hardened the moment he read it. He tore it in half and said nothing, but the weight of it hung in the air like a scream held in someone's throat. Mary asked who it was from. He refused to answer. "It's nothing," he said. "Just old business." But she didn't believe him. Her instincts, long sharpened by a life spent dodging danger, told her otherwise. That week, the house grew colder, even though the air conditioner was off. The tension wrapped around them like fog. Damien began installing more cameras. The gate locks were changed. Joel was no longer allowed to play outside, even with supervision. Mary noticed Damien had started keeping a gun inside a drawer in his study. He never used to. One night, as she tucked Joel into bed, he looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes. "Is someone trying to hurt us?" he whispered. Mary smiled, though her heart was beating too loudly to hide. "No, baby, no one will hurt you." But when she left his room, she closed the door and leaned against it, pressing her hands to her face. That night she dreamed of fire and footsteps. Something was coming. Something she couldn't see but could feel. And for the first time since burying her mother, Mary realized that what began as a sacrifice was now something else entirely. This was no longer just about money, or memory, or guilt. It was about survival. The house grew quieter in the days that followed, but not in the way peace brings silence. This was the silence that creeps in before a storm, heavy and unsettling, like the air before a bad dream. Mary could feel it under her skin. It wasn't just about the letter anymore, nor the way Damien flinched every time the phone rang. It was something else, something unspoken. Joel had become unusually withdrawn. The boy who once wouldn't stop talking about planets and black holes now sat for long stretches in the corner of the living room, drawing strange, jagged figures with red and black crayons. He wouldn't show them to anyone. When asked, he said he was practicing shadows. Damien, on his end, became more distant than he had been in weeks. He buried himself in meetings, rarely ate dinner with them anymore, and often locked himself in his study long after Joel had gone to sleep. Mary felt the air in the house grow heavier, the walls closer, as if the building itself was holding its breath. One night, while cleaning the corridor near the locked keypad room, she heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone breathing behind the door. She froze, pressing her ear to the cool wood, but the sound vanished. When she turned around, Damien was standing at the other end of the hallway, watching her. He said nothing, just stared for a few seconds before walking away. That night, she asked him directly about the room. "What's behind it?" He didn't blink. "It's private." Then he turned away, the conversation finished before it began. She wanted to press, but something in his voice stopped her. There was no anger, only exhaustion, as if the secrets he held were too heavy for even his own spine. Joel disappeared on a Tuesday. It had rained that morning, thick droplets drumming the roof like war drums, turning the compound into a muddy basin. Mary had spent most of the day inside, doing laundry, helping the cook prepare a goosey, and trying to distract the boy with puzzles. Sometime after lunch, Joel said he was going to his room to nap. Mary nodded, told him to call her if he needed anything, and went to fetch fresh towels from the backyard line. 10 minutes later, when she returned with the laundry basket balanced on her hip, his bed was empty. At first, she thought he might be in the bathroom, but the door was open, the sink untouched, and the toothbrush still dry. She checked the kitchen, the front yard, the garden. Nothing. Panic rose in her like a wave breaking through a weak dam. She called his name, once, twice, again. Silence. She ran to the study. Damien was hunched over a laptop, rubbing his temples. "He's not in his room," she said, breathless. His eyes lifted slowly. "What do you mean?" "He's not anywhere," she said. "He's gone." The house erupted. Security was called. The compound was searched top to bottom. Mary ran through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, screaming his name, checking drains and hiding spots. Nothing. No footprints. No gate movement. No witnesses. The security cameras showed nothing unusual. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. By nightfall, Damien was a shell, quiet, unmoving, seated on the couch with his face in his hands. Mary sat beside him, her fingers trembling. The boy she had come to love like her own was gone, and she felt responsible in a way she couldn't explain. Then came the envelope, slid under the door while they were both sitting in silence. It had no stamp, no handwriting. Inside, a single photo of Joel, tied to a chair, but unharmed. His eyes were open, alert, but fearful. No blood, no bruises. Alongside the photo was a note, scrawled with rough strokes. You took from me. Now I take from you. This is just the beginning. Damien didn't speak for a long time after reading the message. He just stood and stared at the picture, like if he looked long enough, he could will the boy back into the room. Mary, meanwhile, felt her entire body tighten into one single, sharp knot. She had seen writing like that before. Not recently. Years ago. Back when she worked cleaning luxury apartments for some of the city's most dangerous men, the kind of people who shook hands with politicians by day and ruined lives by night. There was one woman she had helped once, another maid. Her name was Naya. Mary had almost forgotten her face, until now. Naya had been desperate, broken, abused by a man with connections too deep to fight. Mary had found her weeping behind the generator shed one night, face swollen, arms bruised. She had helped her escape, given her what little savings she had to get on a bus out of Bambara. They never spoke again. But that name you took from me, it wasn't a guess. It was a memory clawing its way to the surface. I think I know who this is, Mary whispered, barely able to get the words out. Damien looked at her, his eyes bloodshot. What do you mean? A long time ago, I helped someone get away, from someone like you. His face went pale. Who? Her name was Naya. He closed his eyes, whispered a curse, then leaned back against the wall. She was his mistress, he said. My business partner. Used her, beat her, then tried to bury the story. I paid her to disappear, to stay quiet. Mary stared at him, fury creeping up her spine like fire. You paid her to vanish? She wanted revenge. I gave her silence. Mary shook her head, realization dawning. She doesn't want money now. She wants pain, he said. And she'll use Joel to give it to us. That night, Damien made calls. All of them quiet, all of them quick. Men arrived, men Mary didn't recognize. They spoke little, wore dark clothes, and began combing through the house, scanning every trace for leads. But Mary knew the truth deep down. Naya wouldn't be found with drones or data. She was from the world of shadows, where women once forgotten come back not to beg, but to make you bleed. Mary didn't wait for police reports or security protocols. She remembered how Naya used to think, careful, patient, always 5 steps ahead. The woman wasn't impulsive. She was precise. Mary retraced old bus routes, revisited hostels where desperate girls once stayed, and knocked on the doors of abandoned buildings where she and Naya used to share stolen bread. Each place was a ghost. But clues lived in quiet corners. At a closed-down factory near the city limits, she found the first one, a red crayon, just like the ones Joel had been using. It was stuck in a crack between the floorboards, as if dropped in a rush. That was enough. She followed instinct, moving from place to place, asking no one, answering to no one, fueled by a fear that burned brighter than sleep or hunger. On the 3rd night, under a collapsed warehouse roof that reeked of damp paper and urine, she heard a muffled cough. She crept inside slowly, heart pounding, her hands trembling. There he was, Joel, tied but unharmed, blinking at her like he wasn't sure if she was real. Mary ran to him, cutting the ropes with a blade she'd hidden in her scarf. Then came a voice behind her. I knew you'd come, Naya said, stepping out from the shadows. She looked thinner than before, but her eyes were sharp, cold, dangerous. You always did like saving people. Mary stood between her and the boy. Let him go. Naya didn't move. He's not the one who needs saving. Silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to collapse. You should have left me there, Mary. You should have let me rot. I couldn't. And now you'll both pay the price for helping a devil pretend to be a man. Mary didn't beg. She looked Naya in the eyes and said, Joel is not him. Don't make him carry your pain. Something in those words, something fragile and raw, cracked through Naya's armor. Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked, and she let them go. No sirens. No police. Just three broken people in a forgotten room, finally walking away from each other without looking back. The city didn't pause to acknowledge what had happened. No headlines. No sirens. No public reckoning. Life continued as it always had, with its loud traffic and louder distractions, people moving past each other with heads full of their own griefs. In the days that followed Joel's return, the household moved in small, cautious motions, like the aftermath of a house fire no one wanted to talk about. Mary barely slept those first few nights. Even with Joel safely under the same roof again, her body held the memory of those missing hours, her pulse still echoing with the fear of what could have been. Joel, on the surface, seemed okay. He laughed again, slowly, clinging to Mary more than usual, always reaching for her hand before going to sleep, whispering, "Don't go," as if afraid she'd vanish too. She stayed, not because she was told to, not out of obligation, but because she couldn't imagine doing anything else. Damien, meanwhile, had grown quieter, not the kind of quiet that pushes people away, but the kind that pulls everything inward, as though he was trying to understand what was left of himself after everything unraveled. He no longer spoke in short commands, or watched the world through tinted glass. He sat longer at meals, listened without interrupting, sometimes just observed Mary and Joel like they were a language he hadn't yet learned to speak. And Mary watched him back, not as a man with wealth or a mistake from her past, but as a figure slowly shedding the skin of who he used to be. They didn't talk about the night at the warehouse. There were no long apologies, no dramatic confessions. Instead, healing came in quiet pieces, one shared breakfast, one laugh, one moment of mutual understanding at a time. One morning, the house felt lighter, not because anything had changed dramatically, but because something unspoken had started to dissolve. Mary was in the garden helping Joel water the struggling mint leaves when Damien stepped outside holding 2 mugs of tea. He didn't say much, just handed one to her, sat beside her on the edge of the tiled step, and watched Joel run around in mismatched socks. The silence between them was no longer suffocating. It had become something else, something living. Damien finally spoke, not looking at her. "I used to think money could make things simple." Mary sipped her tea. "And now?" He gave a small, tired laugh. "Now I think it just buys you better ways to avoid the truth." She didn't respond with philosophy or comfort. She just nodded because some wounds don't want bandages. They want to breathe. He went on, more to the garden than to her. "I failed him," he said. "All this time I thought I was protecting him, when all I was doing was hiding behind walls." Mary turned to him slowly. "You didn't fail him. You just didn't know how to show up." He looked at her then, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. "But you did," he whispered. "You showed up when it cost you everything." She looked down at her hands, now stained with soil and memory. "I didn't come here to save anyone," she said. "I came here because I had no choice. But sometimes, choices find us in the places we least expect." The words hung between them like light filtering through dust. She didn't need him to validate her. But for the first time, it felt like he truly saw her, not as a woman he once paid for a night, not as a helper for his son, but as someone who had walked through fire and returned whole. That evening, he didn't ask her to stay. She stayed anyway. Time moved forward, not in leaps, but in slow, human steps. The weeks began to fold into each other like pages in a well-worn book, each chapter quieter than the last, but richer in texture. Mary remained a part of the house, though her role was never defined. She wasn't staff, she wasn't a tenant, she wasn't a partner. She simply belonged in a way that didn't require labels. Joel began to thrive again. His laughter returned in full, louder, and freer than before, and he no longer drew shadows, but pictures of birds, kites, and his version of their little garden. He often asked Mary about her mother, wanting to know what she looked like, what she sounded like, how she smiled. Mary shared stories slowly, gently, as if unfolding a memory too fragile to touch all at once. And with each tale, something inside her mended. There were days she would sit outside with her eyes closed, letting the breeze brush past her, pretending it was her mother's hand running through her hair. Sometimes she cried, not out of sorrow, but release. Damien changed too. He started opening old boxes, sorting through forgotten things, even hanging a few of Joel's drawings on the wall. He asked Mary once if she wanted to redecorate the guest room. She didn't answer, but the next day he found her there folding fresh sheets and dusting the corners. When she turned around and caught him watching, she simply said, "This room needs light." He nodded. They didn't define what they were building. They didn't talk about the past unless it rose naturally. There was a rhythm now, a calm, unspoken dance between all three of them. And sometimes, at dinner, when Joel talked too fast and Mary laughed too loud, and Damien just sat back watching them, something unnameable filled the space. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was on a Sunday afternoon that Mary found herself alone in the garden, sitting under the mango tree Joel had tried to climb earlier that week. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, and the city's noise was far enough to feel like a distant song. She closed her eyes and thought about everything that had brought her here, the night she sold her body, the funeral that broke her, the silence that almost swallowed her whole. She thought about the house that now held her laughter, the boy who called her his safe place, and the man who had once paid for her pain, but now sat quietly learning how to love without taking. Her life was not redeemed by a fairy tale. There were no miracles, no grand reward for her suffering. What she had was something better: choice, presence, peace in slow doses. She wasn't waiting for marriage proposals or promises. She wasn't chasing rescue or reputation. She had clawed her way back to herself, one breath, one conversation, one cracked door at a time. As the light began to fade, Damien walked out, 2 cups in his hands again. He sat beside her without a word, placed a cup by her side, and watched the sky as orange bled into blue. "I keep thinking about that night," he said after a long silence. "The night everything changed." She didn't need to ask which one. He wasn't talking about the night they met, or the one when Joel was taken. He was talking about the moment he realized she wasn't a woman you could buy or forget. "I didn't deserve any of this," he added. She looked at him, her voice steady. "Neither did I. But we're here now." He nodded, a slow, humble nod. The breeze picked up again, scattering fallen mango leaves around their feet. In that moment, Mary realized that sometimes healing isn't loud. It doesn't come with confetti or applause. Sometimes healing is simply a quiet cup of tea under a tree, beside someone who no longer runs from themselves. And that was enough. Sometimes life corners us in places where choices don't feel like choices, where silence weighs more than words, and survival becomes a kind of courage. But no matter how deep the valley, there is always a road, quiet, crooked, maybe, but it leads somewhere. Don't ever let pain convince you that you're powerless. You are becoming, even when it hurts. May your heart never carry a weight it was never meant to hold. May the nights that broke you give way to mornings that build you. May the people who enter your life bring peace, not pain. May your past never define your worth. and your healing come in full. May your tears water something beautiful. And may you always find strength in the quiet places where no one claps, yet heaven listens. May grace go before you, and mercy follow behind. In the name of peace, wholeness, and new beginnings. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.